Today we're going to be checking out a video by Joe Rogan, sort of, where a guy appears on his program who was a conspiracy theorist that, for some reason or another, decided to prove that Christianity was just a conspiracy theory, and apparently he failed and became a Christian. Now, this is a perplexing premise already, so let's check it out and see what we can make of it.
I was very interested by this because I've looked at every conspiracy theory, moon landing, 9/11, JFK, I mean, all kinds of conspiracies. The one I'd never looked at, and now, I'm 58, so I'm like, okay, let me look at this one, is God. And I said, let me see about this God thing. I've never been a religious guy. And so I start reading and I start talking to people. I also found that around me, like a couple of people I was working with, they're all Christians. And not that anyone was ever pushing anything on me when I asked.
Wow, Christians in a country full of Christians. Imagine that. But notice, he's obviously, as I mentioned before, a very conspiratorial kind of cat. He probably never met the conspiracy he didn't like. And he thinks that for some reason he should frame God as a conspiracy theory when God is just a belief. Now, obviously, I'm an atheist, like he claims to have been, but I don't see God as a conspiracy. Now, I guess you could say that there are certain organizations I view as conspiratorial in some sense or another, like the Mormon Church. They're certainly a big conspiracy all about making some money. The Catholic Church has always been something of a conspiracy about making money. But as a whole, I don't think it's really fair to call religion a conspiracy or the subject of God. That's just sort of like a belief, really, isn't it?
Asked some questions, they were gladly answered. And there's a lot of stuff written about Jesus. There's a lot written, thousands of years of books, and there's some contemporary stuff such as Evidence Demands a Verdict. And, this just is so much. And I got to tell you, Joe.
Evidence Demands a Verdict, I believe, is a book by an apologist who was a detective or something. I think I've done a video on the guy. It's been a while, though. A similar one is The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, who claims to have been an award-winning investigative journalist, which there's really not any proof of.
As sure as I know that Building 7 didn't fall down out of sympathy for Building 1 and 2, God is real, Jesus existed, he was a badass outlaw, and it has changed my outlook on life.
Okay, so I don't think anybody is saying that World Trade Center 7 fell because it had sympathy for the other two World Trade Centers that fell. I think the idea is that it attained structural damage from falling debris and then fell itself. And of course, if he's a conspiracy theorist, so he doesn't really care, but that is an explanation I have heard. Let's continue.
It has really changed the way I look at things. And I believe that we can win with God. I know
I don't really have a lot of strong opinions on Joe Rogan, but one thing I will say I appreciate is this guy telling his story and Joe Rogan just blowing clouds of smoke in his face. Now that is awesome. A kindred spirit of sorts there.
It may sound a little weird coming from me, but I'm all in on this. And
No, I assure you, not much is going to sound weird coming from you. I don't know if you know this, but in general, in society, we typically consider conspiracy theorists to be the weird ones. Not that I'm not or anything, it's just that conspiracy theorists are pretty high on, the weirdness scale, typically.
I'm not you may think of someone who believes in God or Jesus as a crazy right-wing nut job, which I'm obviously not. But man, it's powerful stuff when you put prayer into your life. It's really powerful. The Holy Spirit.
I don't think there's anything.
Let's see some proof for that. Can you, for example, pray over a veteran who lost a limb in a war and have that limb grow back? If your answer is no, then I don't think prayer is nearly as powerful as you think it is.
Weird about it at all. I mean, I think there's a reason why it exists, why it's so prevalent in so many cultures. It helps people.
It's about love.
Yeah.
It's all about love.
Yeah.
I hate to say this, but I kind of agree with Joe Rogan.
What do you think Jesus' role was? Who do you think he was?
Well, he was literally the Son of God, and he was on the earth to teach, and he wandered. I mean, he was an outlaw. He did some crazy shit. He overturned the tax tables, and he really railed against a lot of stuff.
Why do you think?
I must say that, I have my disagreements with this man, as I do Joe Rogan, but I like his style. I really like the way he speaks about these things. I mean, he called Jesus a badass something earlier. It's pretty awesome. I like this guy. I could hang out with this guy probably. We'd probably argue like hell, but I could hang out with him.
based on what information that you have, why do you think that he existed?
The Jesus had to die after teaching us how to live a good life and how to be a good person, which is all about love, and that was to absolve us of our sins, which is kind of a cool out.
But that doesn't really answer the question of why you think he's a real person. Now, I'm not saying Jesus wasn't a real person. I believe in the historicity of Jesus. That is, I think Jesus did exist in some form. Son of God, miracle worker, rose from the dead, absolved all sins. No. But I think he did exist. But you didn't answer the question of why you think he exists. You're answering his role, not his existence. Very different questions.
So everyone's a sinner, everyone's fucked up, everyone's flawed, but you are forgiven for that as long as you try to be better. I mean, that's literally every book in the Bible is about. Like I was reading this morning, I forget what it was, but it's like Jesus said, be quick to listen, slow to answer, and slow to get angry. And I took that here, because I remember last time I was here, which was over a year ago, and a lot of people said, dude, you're a fucking asshole. You keep interrupting Joe. And I did. And you even said, calm down, Adam, calm down. You're excited to talk.
But
I don't think anybody is saying that there is nothing important or worthwhile in the Bible or that there is no wisdom in there. I think I've learned a lot from reading the Bible, as I've learned a lot from reading the Quran or any number of other holy books. I've read Hindu books, I've read Buddhist books. Everybody's got a book. And I try to read as many books as I can. So I've read a lot of holy books. And I'd say I've learned a lot from them all. But that doesn't really attest to their truth so much. For example, I am a big fan of Stoic philosophy. I am not a Stoic, I don't think, but I am a big fan of the philosophy, and I try to use it in my day-to-day life for various reasons. And it's one of those things you get better at as you go, but it's never like perfection. But the Stoic philosophy was very much tied to like this Greco-Roman sort of religion, right? And you can't really separate it from that so easily. However, I guess since I'm an atheist, I follow a very much secularized version of Stoicism, removing it from its context of having gods. I think that is totally fair to do. You can take wisdom while not needing to agree with every point behind said wisdom. We all do that all the time. I don't see why the Bible, because it has good wisdom, has to be from God or so important. Yes, it's a revolutionary work in many regards, but that doesn't make it from God any more than it did that the Stoics had their own works that were pretty awesome and amazing.
that's just normal excitedness. It's not. You're not being an asshole.
But it's better if I listen. It makes everything better so it's just small things like that. But ultimately, it's 100% about love, and knowing that it can be beaten. This evil in the world can be fought against. In fact, it's probably already done. And I'm just new to this, Joe, so I can't answer everything. But I love studying it. I love reading. It's fascinating.
I have to say something else here about like the role of religion. The role of religion has always been, in some sense or another, to give hope to the fundamentally hopeless. And I hate to say this. I don't know anything about this guy, so I'm not talking about him specifically, but I think the things he said, some things match. Religion has always been about giving hope to the hopeless. And from the people I've known, the conspiracy-minded people I've known, they do seem pretty hopeless. They're convinced that there are mysterious, malevolent entities above us that dominate our society, that make us unhappy, that do terrible things. Satanic cabals, Illuminati, that sort of thing. And how do you take on something like that, really? How do you do battle with these malevolent forces? Especially since in a lot of cases, these people think, well, these malevolent forces are also revealing themselves openly. They're not doing their stuff in secret. They're doing it out in the open, like the World Economic Forum thing, the Great Reset thing. This is all stuff happening out in the open. How do you combat something that people aren't even trying to hide? And so I think it does make a lot of sense for conspiracy theorists who have no real options to take on something like Christianity that tells them, but really, the battle is already won, because you see in the end, Christ is king and God wins. It is hope for a hopeless story. It is hope for a hopeless world. As Marx said, the opium of the masses. Completely correct quote, if you ask me. So I suspect there is some level of wishful thinking that came out in his statement there. And again, I don't know this man. I'm not judging him. I don't find it offensive that he has become religious. Nothing like that. I'm just trying to think about it from a, I guess, sort of psychological viewpoint here. I'm just sort of trying to think about what really is behind it because we all have our stories. We have the stories that we tell ourselves about what things mean to us. But oftentimes, we don't really understand the stories we are telling, or how they relate, or if they relate to things going on in our own lives. It turns out humans are not great natural observers of the self, even the best ones. So when I look at somebody like this, I listen to the story they're telling. I do, I listen. But I also want to figure out the story they're not telling, what hides between those lines. And I think what hides between the lines here is, like he just said, in some senses, the battle is already won. Christ is king, God wins. The evil, malevolent forces ruining the world have lost already, they just don't know it yet. And I understand it. And let's be honest, I mean, to an extent, the conspiratorial mindset is a correct one. You can sympathize. Even I'm not a conspiracy theorist in like most ways at all. But I sympathize with it because, yes, there are evil, powerful, malevolent forces called rich people conspiring to just destroy the world and doing it openly, and they don't care. And so, yes, they are out there. I mean, think about how what the algorithms do to us, how they warp our minds deliberately, how these companies aggregate all this data on us and use it to change us into something that is more amenable to their marketing departments. All of that stuff. We have good reason to be paranoid and upset and think the worst. So I understand. I get it. I just think it's kind of misdirected.
So
Fascinating
much
material.
there. It's
I
really
mean,
fascinating.
a person being the actual Son of God, I would need a lot of evidence to
Right.
believe that.
Evidence Demands a Verdict would be a great book to
Yeah.
read. But just as I know that JFK was assassinated, and I really believe the CIA was involved because it's been written. I've just read documents and documents. So when you look into the Bible and everything that's been written about the Bible, that's 100 million times more has been written about that, and it's survived all these years. So I'm
Right,
just
but
I'm
if
just someone
someone
who reads.
writes about the shine,
Okay, so I have a couple things to say here. You may notice me blinking a lot during this video, and I'm not imitating or mimicking this guy in any way. I just have eye problems as well. I don't know what he has, but I have some nerve problems, so just wanted to explain that really quickly. So you don't think I'm, mocking the poor guy for whatever he has going on. The next thing is, so yes, there are a lot of documents about Jesus that have been written over the last couple thousand years, but there is a curious deficit. So we have this man who claims allegedly to be the Son of God, who is going around performing miracles in the Middle East. He's bringing the dead back to life. He's born of a virgin. He's turning water into wine. He's calming the stormy seas. He's feeding the multitudes. He's doing all of these incredible things all around the Middle East. He is being known as a miracle worker. When he dies, he comes back 3 days later, and in one of these stories, he brings back the recently departed of Jerusalem and sends them into the homes of their dead relatives to tell them the good news. Not only that, he also goes and appears to a bunch of his disciples and spends a lot of time proving to them for some reason that he really died and came back. I don't know why you'd have to prove that, let alone do it for as long as he did, but I digress. So he does all of this stuff. And yet, we don't have a single document written about him from before he died. We don't have a single word in history written about him before his demise. Such an important person. And the only things we have are Paul, who never met Jesus, who converted probably 3 or so years after the death of Jesus, who had early writings on him, things he'd heard from other people, who eventually met some of the others, the 12 and such, James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, the rock on which I will build my church, as it were. So he did meet some of these people who definitely knew like the real Jesus, who, as far again, I think really existed in some sense. And yet, we don't have any like other sources anywhere near as close. I mean, Paul is the first one to really write about these things. And the next writings come years and years and years after Paul. The next one to appear is Mark. And then you got Matthew and Luke, and finally John. And these are all written over, what, like a 50-year span or something? 40-year span? That ranges from about 50 AD to 90 AD, around there. And they were based on oral traditions. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not, in fact, written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were not written by people who had ever met Jesus. In fact, not a single book in the New Testament was. You won't find in there a single word written down by somebody who actually knew Jesus or saw him or anything like that. So that's kind of a problem. You can have a lot of documents talking about a person well after they've died, but to have no sources contemporarily mentioning them is something of a problem. Now, in the case of Jesus, I tend to think it's not a problem for the historicity of Jesus himself, for various reasons, which I don't want to go into right now because we've discussed it enough. But we really don't have any evidence for all the miracle working that is attributed to him. Now, I think that a lot of the sayings and such, the Beatitudes and such, could be real sayings of the real Jesus who actually lived. As I think a lot of the stuff were like where he told the 12 that they would become the 12 kings of the 12 tribes when the Son of Man came. Jesus himself seems to have thought the Son of Man was a different person from himself. So there's an interesting thing that a lot of Christians don't know. So we have not a lot of evidence for Jesus existing at all, but we do have at least some, I think, not a whole lot. And what we really lack is any first-hand eyewitness information. And all we have, therefore, is speculation. Think about a story that's told to someone. You tell a story to someone. Now, let's say, I'm sure this has happened to some of you, because I know it's happened to me more than once, so I'm sure it's happened to probably most of you, actually. You tell a story to someone. That someone tells that story to someone else. That story goes around a circle of people and somehow makes it back to you. How often does that story resemble the story you told originally? In what ways does it diverge? Very usually, significantly. Often, very significantly. Significant differences abound. And that's just a small circle of people. Let alone, over potentially decades between the death of Jesus and the writing of his miracles and his sayings and so on and so forth, which does, to me, make things very highly questionable, at the very least.
Shining.
Yeah.
And a bunch of people review the writing of The Shining and write about The Shining. It doesn't mean that The Shining actually happened. Just because so many
Again, great point, Joe Rogan. We're doing great today.
people are writing about this particular religion doesn't mean that there was a person.
But they haven't written about
doesn't mean they weren't. I'm not saying they were. I'm not saying I know. But I'm saying it doesn't mean that man was the Son of God.
I'm just telling you, my process is when I investigate things, and to me it was a conspiracy theory. I'm just going to start reading, and
I don't think practically anyone is saying that Christianity is a conspiracy theory. Although I have noticed that believers, when I explain to them some things about how the Bible was written, they do seem to think I am describing a conspiracy theory. For example, the writing of the Old Testament was not a straightforward process of prophets appearing, laying down their works, and being done with it. No, I mean, the Old Testament really portrays a lot of political struggles, especially like we're talking about during the Babylonian exile, when you had the Babylonian priesthood trying to essentially claim their place from the new rising priests that were left over in the ancient territory of Judea, or Judah, whichever you want to call it, whatever it was, one of those. And these are squabbles they're having. The books of the Bible, the Old Testament, contain these squabbles that these people were having amongst themselves, trying to assert control over the narratives and over the religion. That is just a fact. And yet, when you tell a Christian about this, they will look at you as if you have just grown a second head, or a third head, as it were. And again, yes, I have been accused of being a conspiracy theorist and saying it's all a conspiracy because I have mentioned directly the political struggles involved in the creation of the Old Testament. And the political struggles didn't stop with the Old Testament. Look at the struggles between Paul and Peter and the fake Paul doctrines. Yes, there are fake Paul doctrines. I hate to tell you it, my Christian friends, but even fundamentalist Christian scholars accept that about half of the writings attributed to Paul's were not actually Paul's. And for that matter, the writings attributed to Peter are not Peter's. In fact, it seems like Peter and Paul had major disagreements that were never exactly resolved. And Peter's branch of Christianity seems to have died out because it was very Jewish and didn't catch on among the Jewish population. Paul's did because he dispersed with the whole Judaism thing. He was like, enough of that, but pox on all that, and just sold it to the Gentiles instead. So his version lives on. And again, those are political struggles. Struggles over a religion are still, in essence, political struggles. They're trying to build things, and they're fighting amongst themselves on how to do it. And that's not the only instance. I mean, think about the process of the canonization of the Gospels, but not just the canonization of the Gospels. Think of the Council of Nicaea. They were there to resolve certain, I think you'd call them ecumenical questions, regardless of what you'd call them. They were there to resolve certain doctrinal questions, and I mean, these questions were wide-ranging. So, it's all a lot of struggles. And I guess in a sense, there are conspiracies there. I mean, since people don't know this, it does sound kind of conspiratorial in a lot of ways, doesn't it? You think this guy would love that.
Read for 3 weeks until I gave up and said, I can keep reading, but all the evidence just is thrown at me over and over and over again. If I'm going to believe certain things about JFK or 9/11 or whatever, which I've read as much as I can, but there's not that much. It's just for my own conscience. I have to, if I'm going to believe that after reading 50 years of documentation versus that thousands of years of documentation.
But it's thousands of years of documentation of a story. It's interesting that some people would rather not get there and rather be in a shitty, depressed state as long as they're not duped.
Well, I mean, if you consider truth to be the most important thing, I think that's perfectly reasonable. But I also think that's kind of like a false dichotomy. You don't have to be a miserable person to be all about truth. I think I'm a pretty happy person for the most part. I mean, I'm happily married, enjoying my YouTube quote-unquote career. I have good relationships with my family and friends. I have a wide support network. I'm having a great time, frankly. I mean, I get to see the world. It's nice. So not depressed at all over my godlessness, and actually seem to quite enjoy it. But yes, there are some people who get depressed about the raw nature of the universe, but whether they're depressed or not says nothing about the truth of it. And for that matter, really, neither has this man. He has just said a lot of people have written about this stuff over the last 2,000 years, and that makes quite the case for it. Well, I disagree. I've seen the same things you've seen, and I find them very uncompelling.
But you've been duped by life.
Of course.
Because your life sucks.
But,
I mean, I know a lot of atheists that are super depressed.
The idea is not that God fixes everything. The idea is if you can believe in it and can put yourself in a mindset. I'm just looking at.
I also just want to say that in my experience, the only atheists who are like really super depressed are atheists who are going through something terrible. And I think nobody is immune to that. I mean, if Christians are going through terrible things, they may find some solace in Christianity, but let me tell you, some things you just can't get around or get out of. And I think that's a universal experience. I mean, religion can help to some extent, but just because you don't have a God or a religion doesn't mean you are fundamentally like hopeless or something like that.
A little abstract now.
Yes.
You put yourself in a mindset that things can happen, that miracles do happen, that things do impact your life, and that you look at.
But there's no evidence for any of that stuff. I mean, the impacts that religion can have on your life can be positive for sure. But that's any religion, not just your religion in specific. And when we talk about miracles, we're talking about things that can't happen normally, things that just like violate the rules of the universe. Which, again, we have never seen anything like that. We have never seen something truly miraculous that bends or breaks the laws of the universe. As far as we can tell, nothing supernatural has ever happened.
Things in a different way. You're not always completely fucked up about this is not happening for me or that's not happening. Do
you think it's like psychological software that you can run? Like your belief in God. Do you think that's like psychological?
I think everybody gets frustrated when things don't go their way. I think we're just human, so we do tend to sweat smaller things sometimes, but especially like larger things. I mean, I know that like I can get sad over things sometimes, like things not going certain ways, but in the end, like that's just something you work through, however long it takes. I mean, some things take a long time to work through, but you work through them. And I don't think that's a flaw. I think that's just a part of being human, religious or not.
Logical software that you could just run, and they're like, "Ooh, look, everything's smoother."
No, it's not. No, because everything isn't smoother, but you at least don't freak out when shit isn't smooth.
Right. I don't mean it.
No, I don't freak out when shit isn't smooth. In fact, I mean, my life's pretty rough, and I don't know, I handle it pretty well. Mostly rough because of just like health problems I've had since I was a kid or a teenager. Um, really shitty stuff, or just things like that. I mean, everybody has problems, right? And I don't know, I think I handle it pretty well. Sometimes I have to cancel live streams. Sometimes I have to not do anything until my meds get called in. That's not that bad, That's not like terrible. Sometimes I have terrible agonizing pain that just like messes me up. And that sucks, but what are you going to do? It's not like I sit around lamenting it like, oh God, why do I have to have such pain, right? No, I just accept it for what it is and keep moving, as I think most humans do. I mean, you'd be astounded the things people get used to in life.
In a derogatory way,
No, I
or
know.
a negative way.
I know.
What I mean is like, is that why it's effective? That
Well,
it's like a natural thing that you could run, and it's been honed over time. It only makes sense that it
Well,
has
yes.
been,
Well, here you
right?
go. I love this.
So it just sort of
Again, Karl Marx, opiate of the masses, or opium of the masses, as it were. I think that quote just encapsulates perfectly what Rogan's trying to say here. Joe Rogan, read Karl Marx. I mean, not Capital. You'd die trying to read Capital, but read, some other Marx. You'd love it. You'd enjoy it. He even says the N word. You probably enjoy that, right? I don't know much about Joe Rogan.
slides.
What is the software?
into-
What is the code? It's the Bible. It is the gospel, scripture. That is, if you want to look at it that way, it is the code that you run in your brain, and it does things for you.
Yeah.
I think I must also add here just another thought, which is he looked into the one religion, the one interpretation of God and the universe. What about all the others? How does he know that Islam isn't true? I mean, if any religion has been fraught with peril, if any religion has been on the chopping block in America, it's Islam, right? So how much has he looked into that? Or other religions, more mystical religions like Hinduism, or more grounded religions like Buddhism. How much did he look into those before deciding, yes, Christianity is the correct one, because I have looked into them all and decided they were all nonsense, which I think gives me a little bit of an advantage.
So that's a way of looking at it. And that's a kind of a good way, actually. I hadn't thought of that one. I like that.
Yeah. Like
I
a
like that.
like a psychological software.
Sure.
But the problem is, if he was really good at it and really successful in a time when people were not very sophisticated, he could probably pull that off. And then when he dies, everybody would say he was the son of God.
Sure.
And we don't know.
No.
So how would you know that this guy who lived 2,000 plus years ago
That's why.
is actually
I like how Joe Rogan is just hammering him with the same question over and over that he's refusing to answer. And like it's a good question, and the way he phrased it was excellent. I mean, think about that part of the Roman Empire. The area that is today Israel was a backwoods, backwater hellhole back then, right? I mean, in a lot of senses, it kind of still is. No offense to anybody from there who lives there or is dealing with genocide currently. But yeah, I mean, it's just like it was always in history kind of like a nasty place for the things that happened there. It was always in tumult and turmoil, right? And when you look at that area in the times that Jesus would have lived and died, what was it like there? Well, the literacy rate was probably somewhere around maybe 5% at its highest, and I mean that's not like a very high rate, is it? Now think about, let's say, the 1830s in America, where about 95% of the population is literate, and Joseph Smith still happened and created Mormonism whole cloth. And Mormonism today controls one state in the United States, Utah, and has something like 16 million on the books members, although I'd say the real amount of members is much lower than that. But the fact that Joseph Smith, a outright known con man, who we have records of being an outright known con man, could pull the wool over people's eyes like that in a literate era where we literally had people writing down all of his crimes and such. The fact that he could pull that off, I think, that is pretty like it's going to be pretty wild to think that somebody in the Middle East 2,000 years ago couldn't have pulled off even crazier. I mean, think about all the miraculous stuff attributed to Joseph Smith. Now imagine what more miraculous stuff you could, or claims you could get away with making 2,000 years ago when the literacy rate was much lower. Think about that. Just feast on that for a second, why don't you? Think about that.
Actually, the Son
That's
of God.
why I call myself a believer.
Because you just believe.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Well, how scientific, how rational, how skeptical, how reasonable.
And I've seen what it has done for my own life.
what does it do for your own life when you believe?
It makes me a very happy person. Prayer does work, not if you're asking for stuff for yourself, but I've experienced, it's not really just the miracles that I've experienced, but it really makes me happy. Good things.
Okay, so if it makes you happy, that's cool. I'm fine with that. That's not a problem for me. If you, whatever makes you happy, you know, if being a Christian makes you happy, well, by all means, please proceed, Governor. But if you're claiming miracles or that prayer works, I'm gonna need some evidence for those claims. I mean, this guy, he's a conspiracy theorist. He wants evidence to prove conspiracies actually happen, right? He looks for that. So, where's the evidence for your stuff? Where's the evidence for your claims? If you're going to ask for evidence for other claims, I'm going to ask for some for yours too, buddy.
Things have been happening.
So you just find it effective. It works for you.
Of course.
And
yeah.
so you're just saying
Yeah.
this has helped your life. How can you possibly
You can
prove...
never get to the end. Of course not.
Right.
But
you can never prove. You can prove that people believed it.
Okay, so they're just going in circles because Joe Rogan wants to know, like, why do you believe these things? What evidence is there for them? And this man doesn't really have anything. He's just like, well, I believe it, so, you know, I just, it makes me happy. But how do you know it's true? Well, it makes me happy. Like, well, that's not really an argument, is it? That's an argument that something makes you happy. Plenty of things in life can make us happy. I mean, drugs make a lot of people happy. Are they good for you? Are they the truth? No, they're drugs. They're bad for you. They're harmful. They hurt you. So I think like this is like a huge blind spot here. I'm glad Joe Rogan kept on him about it. And, you know, I guess that's just one of Joe Rogan's greater moments to me, because like I've seen plenty of Joe Rogan. I thought, wow, that's terrible. But this one, fantastic job, Joe Rogan. You really did good here. Other guy, well, not so much. But I have to say, again, I like his style. I appreciate his style. Assuming he hasn't been accused of any weird stuff lately, like, you know, any of the normal things people like this get accused of. I like him. I'm sure we'd argue like hell, but we could also have a beer together probably. So, good on you for doing what makes you happy. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And I hope you have a great one out there.